All right. Hey guys, thanks for everything. I'm in the process of setting up my first lead generation asset. I'm going after the photography niche. Should I brand the site like any other photographer, example, Shutterbug Photography, or should I go with something like edmontonphotographer.com? No, go with a branded name or a branded domain if that's what you're talking about, because you're much better off with brand guys, with a branded, a branded domain and a branded, like a brand name, than trying to use exact match keywords or exact match keyword domains. Those are all like, we don't recommend that for many reasons, because it looks spammy, it sounds spammy. For GMB assets specifically, you want to try to get away from doing anything spammy, including the name itself. And also exact match domains typically will trigger penalties a lot easier or quicker with a lot less. It takes a lot less, in other words, to trigger a penalty, because even a soft penalty, because again, it's already optimized right off the bat. And so everything that you do has that additional layer of optimization. And so I don't recommend that at all. If you're new to the SEO game, then I completely understand why you would think that might be something to go after, using exact match keyword domain and perhaps, an exact match or even partial match keyword for the brand name itself. But I recommend that you go with something that's branded instead. It will allow you to get away with a lot more SEO stuff without it actually triggering a penalty. Any comments, guys?
It's also pigeonholing yourself if you go Edmonton photographer, right? What if you don't want to what if you want to start ranking for something else besides Edmonton or in the surrounding areas of Edmonton? If you just go, if you go with branded and and then you have a locations page, Edmonton and whatever else. God, I'm sorry, I'm not that familiar with Canadian geography, but you go with photographer. Let's just say photographer.com, but it should be a brand, and then you're going to have a locations page, and then you're going to have Edmonton and whatever other cities, and then you can offer services, or you can have services plus city, whichever way you set up your silo, you have a lot more flexibility than if you start off with Edmonton photographer and you're going to offer wedding photographer. And so you have to be really careful with how often you use the word photographer, so that you don't get filtered for all these things. And you have all these bad things that can happen with a TLD when you go with an exact match domain. You have to be really careful with the keywords and how you use them.
Yeah. And so the next question is from him as well. And he says, and so it clarifies his first question a bit. He says, I'm confused how I branded this thing, especially when it comes to the GMB. Is it a photography company branded like a regular business, or is it something like wedding photography location name? If it is set up as a business, then when someone calls, won't they be confused when another business that they are sent to? Yeah. And so, and I talked about this a lot in Local Lease Pro on how to resolve that kind of an issue. So typically what I've done in the past is I would set up kind of a generic type name, but again, it would still be a brand name, not an exact match keyword, because or even for that matter, a partial match keyword. So for example, I used Home Pros a lot. Like I would use the city name Home Pros for like remodeling or general contractors and things like that, because it's a related type term, but it's not something that is a keyword that people typically search for. People don't search for remodeling contractors by typing in, Home Pros, but it makes sense because it's related, right? And then once the assets would rank and start producing, when I would find a service provider that wanted to purchase the leads from me or lease the asset from me, however we, whatever agreement we came to, then after a few months, if they had proven themselves to be good service providers and it looks like they were going to be long-term, then I would rebrand it. Okay. And that's part of the reason why we've talked about not building citations. There's a number of reasons why you don't want to build citations for a lead generation asset. One would be if you plan on rebranding it, because then you have to go back and update all of the existing published citations. But the other thing is if it's a spammed GMB, in other words, if it's a Google My Business address that you use to verify, or excuse me, a listing that you got verified, that you don't have access to the actual address where it was verified to, then you don't want to build citations, because once you start building citations, naturally that physical location will start receiving mail as solicitation offers from marketing companies and directories and all kinds of things, and it will be addressed to that business name. So if you purchased a GMB asset that was verified by somebody else, then you don't want to do citations, because next thing you know, you're going to start getting business mail sent to that location, and it could very easily be reported by whoever's at that location, right? Whether it's a business or a residential address, somebody's going to be getting mail that's addressed to a business that doesn't actually exist there. And so that's one reason I said don't build citations. But another is if you are going to rebrand it for the service provider that you end up ultimately, securing for that location, or for purchasing those leads or whatever, then you also don't want to build citations, right? So that's why I said if you're gonna do one of the things that I've done as far as how do you resolve that? Well, I use a call center for all of my lead generation assets, where the calls go directed to what I use is, it's called Answer Connect, answerconnect.com. And I set up a script where they answer the phone. And so let's say that it's, Shutterbug Photography is the name of your business, right? Your lead generation asset. And let's say it's going to Joe Smith's Photography is the actual photographer that's going to be handling it. Then the way that I would set it up is that the call center would answer it as Shutterbug Photography, part of the Joe Smith Photography Group, or something like that. And so it's just a way to inject the actual business name that the leads are going to be serviced by into the introduction, or the greeting when the caller answers the phone. So again, I've said this many times, if you're going to be building lead generation assets, you're better off using a call center if you're going to be directing leads, having calls coming in. Because another reason why you want to do that, and I talked about this, I think in the last Hump Day Hangouts, is because when you start getting calls, if you forward the phone number directly to the business, unless they have a full-time receptionist, and a photographer might, unless they have a full-time receptionist, they're going to get hammered with a bunch of solicitation calls. It's funny how when you rank a Google asset, or rank on the first page, but primarily in Maps, when you rank in Maps, all of a sudden you start getting a bunch of calls from marketing and advertising agencies. Like Yelp is one of them. Again, I use contractors a lot as examples, but Home Advisor will absolutely start hammering contractor lead generation assets with phone calls, trying to sell them leads. And so, and it's funny that only happens once you're ranked on page 1. When you're ranked on page 2, when you really need those types of lead, like in other words, I would think as a marketing and advertising agency, they would be targeting page 2, but they're always targeting the page 1 people. So anyways, my point is the business will get inundated, will get hammered with solicitation calls. And so that could actually piss a business off. And I know it because I've been doing this for years. So that's why I always recommend setting up a call center, because the call center will screen the calls and filter out the solicitation calls. Those won't ever go. Those messages won't get to the business that's going to be purchasing leads from you, or leasing the asset, or however you work it out. Now, if they got a full-time receptionist, that's the receptionist's job. You can still forward it to them. But in that case, I would have a whisper on the line, right? If you're directing the phone calls directly to the business, and the business has a receptionist or somebody that answers the phone regularly, then I would put a whisper on the line that states that the call is coming from your lead generation asset. So for example, if you named it Shutterbug Photography, I would have the whisper say call from Shutterbug Photography, or call from Shutterbug, or something like that, so that when they answer the phone, they're going to hear that right as soon as they pick up the phone, and they're going to know that they should greet it as Shutterbug Photography, part of the Joe Smith Photography Group, or something like that. Does that make sense? However you word the greeting. But it's just a way to inject the actual service, whoever's servicing that lead, into that actual greeting, so that it doesn't confuse people. And I've always told this to people in the past, like a lot of tree service contractors wouldn't know when I was called, like how to respond to a customer when they would go out to the customer's location to give them an estimate for a tree service job, when the caller called in and it was a different tree service company name, because it was a lead generation asset. I've always told them, you just tell them that's our lead generation website. and it just hasn't been updated with our brand name. That's all you have to say. So my point is, don't lie. Just try to work it into, come up with a creative way to work it into there to where you say, the service provider's name in the greeting as well as whatever. And if the question ever came up, well, I called Shutterbug Photography, why is Joe Smith Photographer answering the line? Say, oh, well, that's because that's a lead generation website that we've had on the web that just hasn't been updated yet, or something like that. And I've always been able to get around it that way and never had any issues. So that's how I would recommend that. Again, you build it with kind of a generic brand name like Shutterbug Photography would work well. Don't know if that's really what you were planning on using, but use that as your brand name until you get a service provider that's going to be in place for what you hope to be long term. Don't do it right away. Don't switch the brand right away, because what happens if you find out that they're not they're not going to pay you on time, or they're a pain in the ass to deal with? You don't want to start switching the brand name of a GMB. And that said, just so you guys know, a lot of stuff that you're doing in GMB right now is a bit, I would caution you making any sort of significant changes in the Google My Business assets, except for perhaps when you first set it up, because Google is certainly on a rampage right now with triggering suspensions for the slightest kind of changes. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. So I don't know that I've gotten away with changing the location name of GMB assets, many times in the past, even changing the location address without triggering a suspension or a re-verification. But right now, Google's got what I call an itchy trigger finger. They're looking to suspend with some of the slightest changes. If it's a brand new listing, you might be able to get away with some immediate changes, but once it's been established or aged for any period of time, it seems like any sort of significant change can trigger a suspension. Now, that all might change again in a few weeks or a few months. I don't know. But right now, it's a bit hairy. I would recommend staying away from any sort of big changes. But that's why I said, guys, there was a period of time of almost an entire year now that we could get away with murder. And now they're really cracking down on it. And this is a fluid type of business, guys. You have to evolve with what's going on in the current state, or you know what I mean? And so that's why I don't recommend going after building a bunch of lead generation assets right now. In fact, we kind of more or less, I think Marco would agree with me, I have kind of switched back to building a real GMB asset that you can have access to, verifying the address, that kind of stuff, and then building that out local GMB Pro style, instead of building a bunch of additional assets that could potentially get terminated or suspended right now. Marco, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I hate doing a whole bunch of work for when it's possible that you're going to get shut down. Think about this, and I mentioned this in another group that I was talking to. Someone has an Uzi right now, and they're just blasting anything that moves. Why in the fuck would you stick your head out right now? It's really that simple. Think about it. So that's happening. Someone's got the Uzi out. They're shooting anything that moves. You don't stick your head out. You turn around and get the fuck out the way. So right now, just leave it alone. And the way to do it is you go to local GMB Pro, which is totally, you can work in somebody else's asset, right? A real company with a real GMB. And if anything happens, you can go and ask for the suspension to be removed. It's a whole lot simpler. You can still apply all of the principles that are taught to this area, except that controlling the asset has become just almost impossible. I'm not going to say impossible, because nothing's impossible. Somebody will figure something out, another way to get around Google, and it'll go wide open again, Wild West. But in the meantime, it's almost impossible for you to control the asset. Meaning that if it gets suspended, there's no way for you to recover the asset. You just have to let it go. And now you lost however much time you invested in it. That's another one of the reasons why all this time is always it's so valuable that I had to come up with a way, instead of rebranding these assets, right, and for somebody else, come up with a simple solution, so that my staff or I wouldn't have to go through all the work of rebranding, and that's just giving the person that answers the phone a simple line, couple of seconds.
Yeah.
And that takes care of everything. Think about how much time you just save if you do it that way than if you do a brand and then you try to rebrand. Yeah. So it's time. Don't waste all that time on shit that might not pay off. It might. You might get away with it. And I mean, if you're willing to take the risk, then go ahead and gamble on it. I'd rather go and work on something that I know is going to be around for a while, and especially if it's a client or something that's really important, that's making me money. I don't want to lose it.
Agreed.